Hello class, welcome to Python or Programming Logic with Python, week 3, I believe. Um, so because I've had some students email with regard to the URL validator lab or assessment, like with questions about it, some errors here and there. Um, yeah, this week's assignments are a bit tougher than previous weeks because we are getting into a little bit more complicated stuff. I kind of figured we could just focus on the labs again. Yeah, the PowerPoint's important, but I think that's something you guys can review on your own. The PowerPoint isn't up yet. I kind of wanted to get this up first because there were so many questions because you guys are starting to do your homework like at the beginning of the week, which is great. So I wanted to get this out as soon as possible. So let's get into the first lab. The first lab is kind of just, it's a lot more simple than the URL validator. It's really just a program the scenario, write a program that fetches the first count amount of elements of the list. So they want us to create a script that contains, so they say array, but I think it's like a typo or the person who wrote it didn't really know the difference between an array and a list. They do serve different purposes in Python. There's different ways of like using both. I think the biggest difference between a list and an array is that you have to declare the array before using it in your code, meaning like you have to import array. And for a list, you kind of just, because it's a built-in function in Python, you just write it in your code and it just goes through. So in this specific example, we just kind of are going to use the list built-in function. So if there was confusion there, I hope that clears it up. You're using a list, not an array, so don't start importing stuff. It's completely unnecessary. Cengage will give you 100% with the list, and I'll even show you. So the first line, or the first step, open up the main.py file. Second step, on the first line, create the following array. So they give you the line of code they want you to do. It's very basic. You're declaring the variable of numbers. So numbers is our variable here. And now we're equating its value to a list. A list is within the square brackets, and we're just calling a bunch of different integer values. So 34, 9, 32, 91, 58, 13, 77, 21, 56. And we close our list with the square bracket as well. And that's it for step 2. Step 3, they want us to print the array numbers and fetch the so print the array numbers and fetch user input count. So count is actually a whole new variable that we haven't created yet. So let's create count for the number of elements to fetch from the array. So when they say elements to fetch from the array, elements refer to each member of the list. So 34 would be an element, 9 would be an element, 32 would be an element, 91 would be an element, and so on. So they want us to ask the user to tell us how many elements should be printed out or taken out of the list. So to do that, we would do int input being so that the user can input like an integer to us. So that's why we preface it with int. And within it, we have to give the user instructions. So we can do like, please give us number of elements to pull from list. All right. I'm gonna do a colon. I'm gonna do a space before the end of the quotation marks. The reason being that way when the user inputs their integer value, it's not right on top of the string that I just created. That way there's space between the two. It just looks more pleasing to the eyes. So step 4, they finally want us to print out the slice of the array, the list, from the first element. So the first element is 34, but to represent 34, we kind of have to understand the index positions of elements. So 34 technically falls under the index position of 0. So when I refer to 34 in a list, I can just say the index position of 0, or 0 refers to 34 in that list. 1 would refer to 9 in that list. Index positions just are like easier ways of calling certain elements in a list, or like referring to certain elements in a list. So we're going to use that concept here. So we're going to do a print statement. Make sure I line up my code. The print statement, obviously they want us to print the list itself, but not the entire list. So we're going to use the slicing colon operator, as we've used in last week's labs, I believe. So how do we slice this list to give us what we want? So they want us to start our slicing from the very first element, which is 34, which we know is index position 0. So we'll do 0. We'll do our colon operator, which is used for slicing. And they want us to end our slice on the nth element, or the nth being the user input number, which we don't know yet. But we do know the variable that represents that number, which is count. So that's why we're going to enter in count. And that's it for the code. That's legit it. So now we would do, actually, I forgot this part. Okay, so let's go back. I actually did forget this part. So they want us to print their array numbers, and then they wanted us to fetch the count user input. So yeah, I did skip that part because I was so focused on count being the new variable that we were declaring. So they do want us to print the list of the numbers just so that the user sees the entire list, and then they also see the numbers that were pulled out of the list. So for this, we're going to do list of numbers, and then we could do space, and then to separate our string from the variable, we do have to use a comma here. And now we can do it, it's going to look more pleasing for the user. So let's do Python 3, main.py. So, okay, so this is what they see first. They see the list of numbers, which is so that the user has an idea of what numbers they want to keep and what numbers they want to take out. So please give us number of elements to pull from list. Like say the user just wanted the first 4. So 34, 9, 32, 91. They would type in 4 and they would get the first 4. Why? Because when we do our slicing, we're beginning our slice at the first element, which is index position 0, which is 34, and then we're beginning there, and then we're only saying give us the first 4 elements. So that doesn't mean 34, 9, 32, 91, 58. It's just the first 4 elements, which is 34, 9, 32, 91. And that's it. That's really the activity. And if I go to the very bottom and I click on the check mark, that should give me a correct. It is taking a little bit of time. Yep, 4 out of 4 checks passed. Great. So hopefully I explained it in a way that makes sense, why we use certain pieces of code. The code isn't long. It's just making sure that you use the right slicing operator, you use the right parameters for that slicing operator, so 0, count. And the reason we put it within these brackets is we're taking the list, which is stored in the variable of numbers, and we're slicing within it. So that's why we do the bracket there. We can't just do that slice without numbers because then we're slicing nothing. So yeah, that's the first activity. And then let's move on to the URL validator, which is, I know, one that you guys had a lot of questions about. This one's a bit longer, so it might take a little bit longer to explain why we're doing certain things here. I'm just going to skip the scenario part. You have been tasked. Well, let me read through it really quick. You have been tasked with. Okay. You have been tasked with building a URL validator for a web crawler. A web crawler is an application that fetches a web page, extracts the URLs present in that page. Blah blah blah. They're just telling you what a URL validator is. Grading. Yeah, I'm not going to read that. Introducing a split function. A split function is a string method. We've used the split function before, so um, we've used a version of it. Not necessarily the one we're going to be using here. So the way they're explaining it is split function is a string method. It is used to create a list of words that is separated by a particular delimiter. So a delimiter could be any character, a comma, a space, or any word. For example, a student's details are given by, so they give us a string. The entirety, it's not a list, it is a string. So within this string, they give us three different, they're not different elements, but things they want us to separate. So you got John, you got his age, which is 25, and you have English. Like I said, this is not a list, it's a string. If you want to create a list, you would use the split function. So this string exists within student detail, which is the variable. At the very end of the string, they do the point or period split, and then you have to enter in an argument within the split parentheses. In the split parentheses, they're saying, okay, um, you're gonna do open quotation marks, and then you're gonna include the either the comma, the character, or space that you want to be the sort of separating uh, separating body between your um, different words or different numbers. So like if we go back to John 25 in English, they're all being separated by a comma, right? So within our argument of split, within the split function, our argument is saying split according to commas. So every time you see a comma, split the string. And then once you're done splitting the string by commas, we're gonna store it. We're gonna store like the leftovers in a list. And obviously that list is gonna contain strings within it, but those strings are gonna be separated. They're not gonna be one string. They're gonna be three different strings. So that's why when we then print out student detail, we get a list of three different strings: John, 25, and English. They give you another example. If John 25 and English were originally in one string separated by that line that goes straight down, if we do the split function again, but this time the argument we pass is that line, it's gonna every time it sees that line, it's gonna split the string, like basically like chop it up, throw it in a list format, and then output it as we see here. So that they're just introducing the split function. It is different than the split colon operator that we've been using. Um, so yeah, they're introducing it because they want us to use it here in this example. So validation, a URL is in the form of protocol colon. So okay, so this isn't code right here. They're just trying to give you the format of how a URL looks like. So when they say protocol colon, they legit just mean HTTPS colon. HTTPS is a protocol. It's one of the protocols, and they give you a list of protocols here. And then they say, okay, you got your protocol colon forward slash hostname. Hostname being like www.google.com. Well, Google. Google is your host name. And then you got, so let's say your file info. So they do have an example. backspace this. They do have an example of file extensions. So like here we got our protocol here, right here. I'm going to highlight that. We got our host name here, right? And then it looks like we got like a path in which we saved like a document from there. Maybe we downloaded something from there. And it's HTML, right? So this HTML at the very end of this long address is the file info. And they give us a list of different file extensions. So we got the GIF, we got PNG, JPEG, doc, HTML, and so on. So here they give us a whole bunch of URL examples. So yeah, don't worry about this output saying true. We're gonna get to that. Just pay attention to the URL examples. I'm gonna copy one of them because we are going to use it when we finish writing the code. So hopefully it stays there. Step 3. Okay, so now we're gonna actually get into the coding process. What's nice about what they did was they gave us the skeleton of the code that we, as like a starting point, which is very nice. What we have to enter in is not a lot, but the precision does matter. And positioning, as you guys have emailed me, the indentations of your code does matter because in Python we don't have like curly brackets to separate bodies of code. Bodies of code are separated in Python based on indentation. So keep that in mind. So writing best practices follow writing detailed comments and doc strings, organizing and structuring code for readability. Yeah, it says readability, but also functionality, because if your code isn't structured correctly, meaning you're not grouping bodies of code together, it's not only going to not be readable, but it's not going to work. And then URL, this is just so to remind you if you're not familiar with what a URL looks like. So the first step, create 2 lists of strings, one list for protocol called valid protocols and one list for storing file extension called valid file info. So just from that, we already know we have to create 2 variables, and they gave us the variable names. Let's finish reading. So yeah, we could write the 2 variables. So it says your code starts here, so I'm gonna do it right underneath that pound sign. So I'm gonna do valid underscore protocols. I'm not sure what it's equal to yet. I have to continue reading, so I'm just gonna write the name of the variables first. File info. Okay. For this, take the protocol list. Take the protocol list should be restricted to HTTP, HTTPS, and FTP. So I'm kind of just gonna follow the same format of including a list. So it is the square brackets, and within it, I can't just type HTTP like it shows up here, because if I were to do that, it's almost like I am calling a variable, but there's no variable called HTTP. So I'm just going to represent them as like strings. So HTTPS or HTTP, and then comma, HTTPS, comma, FTP. FTP. So that's that. Now I'm gonna assign the value for file info, and I'm using this stuff up here, but obviously I'm putting the single quotation mark around them. So .html, .csv, .docx. .docx. Okay. So far, so good. File extension should be listed as, okay. They want us to, well, actually, this should probably check off. Yeah, okay, so that's one check. So split an input named URL and then use the first element to see whether the protocol of the URL is in the valid protocols. Similarly, check whether URL contains a valid file info. So they don't really give you guidance on how to do that, but they do say split. So they did introduce another way of splitting strings, like because we do have strings here. So yeah. Um, the first thing I'm going to tell you, since they don't really give you too much guidance here, we do want to create another variable in before these two, and we want to call it protocol valid, um, because we are going to call it a little bit later in our code, and this variable is really just going to represent whether the user inputted protocol, the user inputted URL is a valid, like uses a valid protocol. So like say later on in this code, when the user does execute it, they enter in a URL that is like not HTTP, not HTTPS, not FTP. It's like maybe they typoed. Maybe they did like HTWP. If they did that, then that's where this variable is going to come into play. So I'm going to I'm going to assign this variable's value to true. Um, and this variable is going to be used in our Boolean statement a little bit after the fact, because I think they do mention it. So yeah, write the conditions to return a Boolean value of true if the URL is valid, and false if the protocol or the file extension is not valid. So that's what this is for. Um, and we're also going to create another variable for file info because this variable is just for protocols. This is if a protocol is valid. Obviously, you can be like, okay, then write protocol or write file name valid as well. We will, just not yet. Why? Because this block of code is just for protocols. We're going to get to file info later. Um, and it does matter where we place our file info variable. Um, if we place it here, it won't work. It has to be in the block of code that is using it. Um, as for this list of file info, it's okay for it to be here because it's like it's just a list um, of acceptable file extensions, not necessarily something that includes whether it's true or false. So that's why we're not putting it up here. So now we do have to use a split function. So I'm gonna do a space. I'm gonna do protocols. So actually, they do say comment. So I am gonna comment. I'm gonna do this is gonna represent represents first split first represents split the URL to get protocol. Because when we do ask the user at the very end when the program's done to enter in an entire URL, how are we going to know if the protocol included in that URL is valid if we have this really long URL? We have to cut the part we don't need and only keep the beginning, and that's what we're going to do here. We're going to cut that entire string, that URL string, and we're just going to keep the protocol part. So the way we do that is we're going to define protocol. We're going to equate it to so protocol is a brand new variable. It hasn't been called before, even though it says protocol up here. This is a comment. This is just a multi-line comment. This is not included in our code. So don't think that this stuff up here is part of your code. It's not. Your code, as it says, starts here. And so yeah. And this gray stuff is also a comment. It's just a single line comment. So we're declaring a whole nother variable called protocol, and we're going to equate it URL. Why? So URL is actually called or first referenced up here. What URL is basically whatever the user is going to input. We're going to see how we assign URL to a user input later on, but right now we can call it here because it was called up all the way up here in the def function. So URL period. Now we're going to use that the same syntax of the split, so split open parenthesis, and within it, how are we going to split our URL? If we already know that the URL if the URL format is this right here, so URL equals protocol, we want the protocol, that's all we want. So URL equals protocol, and then this is what separates protocol from hostname, this colon 2 forward slashes. So if we want to split that entire URL just so we can keep protocol, the way to do it would be, I already did the quotation marks, so this double forward slash. You would think you're done here, but you're not. So double forward slash. Remember, when we use the split function, it takes the remainder of whatever got split, not the stuff that got cut off, whatever was split in, and then it puts it in a list. Remember, a list format. If we want to call it, we do have to call the what's it called? The index position of that list. So we talked about index position in the last lab. So the index position of the first element in our list would be 0. So we're going to put 0 here. Yeah, you can say that, well, there's only one element in our list. True, but it's also important to reference that one element when we're writing this syntax. So that's why we're putting 0. So really, protocol is what it's basically like. Say I'm entering in https://www.google.com, and I don't have a file extension. This is all I have. This is what I enter when the program's done. I'm entering it in over here. I'm just typing it here for now for just to show you what protocols actually equated to. So when URL split does its slicing, what it does is it says, okay, you got HTTPS. Oh, we see the colon double slash. So that means we're going to delete all of this, and we're not going to include that. And so you're only left with HTTPS. But what it does is now it's going to throw it in a list. So now it's going to do that. And if I want to tell, like, say there was more than one thing, right? So say like I did, the reason this 0 is important is like, okay, so say I did HTTPS, right? And I did this, www.google.com, and then I did, and I'm just like, say I did this for whatever reason, or say this appears later in my code for whatever reason, colon forward slash, typically it's like this, and then you do like, I don't know, stuff like that. You know URLs are like super long, and say the URL did include another colon double forward slash for whatever reason. It typically doesn't, but say it did. If the split function were to see 2 of them, it would take TD in this case, right? Well, technically it would take all of this. It would take www.google. So it would take www.google.com/td. So in our case, this is just an example. I'm just showing you the importance of putting 0 here. When the split function does work, in this fantasy example, it would throw two elements in our list, HTTPS and www.google.com/td. Um, and 0 represents the first index position of our list, which is HTTPS. So it would ignore this. This would still exist in the list, but it would just say, okay, protocol equals index 0 of this list, which is HTTPS. So what it really means is protocol equals HTTPS, which is what we want. Obviously, when like you will never see a colon double forward slash later on in your URL typically, but this is just to show you why it's important to do it anyways. That way your code is like foolproof. So let's get back to where we were. So I believe I spoke about the split function. So let's go to the Boolean statement. So I'm going to do double enter. So here we have the Boolean if statement. That's what we're going to use. It is important because we're going to compare the protocol variable with our list of valid protocols. And the way we do that, so I'm going to do Boolean. This is just a comment if statement. And then underneath it, I'm going to type my Boolean statement. So I'm going to do if protocol. So I'm referencing this right here, this variable right here. I'm calling it again. Obviously, we don't know the value of this variable yet, but I'm creating, I guess, like a conditional statement. So like I'm saying to the program, if whatever that URL is not. So I'm going to use a operator called not in. So this operator basically compares the value of protocol with whatever I'm going to put here. And I'm going to put valid protocols. Because this valid protocols, we defined it this list right here of HTTP, HTTPS, and FTP. So this statement right here is basically just saying if what the user put in is not in valid protocols, if it's not in this list, then protocol equals, or protocol valid equals false. Why protocol valid? So I'm taking this variable, the variable I told you was important, and I'm assigning it another value. So under normal conditions, protocol valid would be true. So if this Boolean statement were to run, say the protocol the user entered in was valid, it was HTTP. So when this Boolean statement runs, it says if HTTP is not in valid protocols, if the user input is not in valid protocols, return false, or change the value of protocol valid to false. If it is, then we don't do anything, and protocol valid stays true. That's all this is doing. So this is just kind of like a fail-safe if the user inputs an invalid protocol. We return false. So that's basically it for protocols, for valid protocols. So we basically finished the first part, which is the knowing if a user URL is using a valid protocol. Now we have to make sure the user URL is using a valid file extension, meaning .html, .csv, or docx. It could only be one of those three. So I'm going to do a double space here. Going to make sure my indentation is correct. So for this, we're going to do this a little bit differently than we did the file or the protocol. So we are going to use well, first, now we're going to declare that variable just as we declare protocol valid up here. We're going to give file name info underscore valid, and we're going to assign it false. And you might be like, why not true? You'll see. So we're going to use, instead of the if statement alone, we're going to use the for statement with an if statement nested inside of it. So our for statement, the syntax for the for statement is you do for, and then you, within it, we're going to do, so new space there. The very next word after for is going to be a dummy variable. That's the best way to kind of explain it. Obviously, if you want, you could research a little bit more on what the for statement syntax, but the way I look at it is it's more of a dummy variable. So I'm going to name my dummy variable. I'm going to say, okay, for f_info, right? And I'm going to say if, well, this is for f_info in, and then we do valid file info. And file info was originally declared all the way up here. So basically I'm just saying this statement, this for statement, is for f_info in this line. What the for statement is basically doing is this f_info is gonna represent each of these values. It's gonna go through each of them. It's gonna check each of them in our statement. It's a little bit confusing, but just know that this f_info is basically checking each of these, and that's why we're using it. It's a way of easily going through our list and checking against these values. So let's go to underneath it. We're going to nest our if statement. So we're going to do if we'll do URL, because we're still doing the URL up here, and that's the URL that the user's going to manually input. And we're going to do ends with. So this is a whole nother sort of function within Python. And we're going to check to see if the end of the URL ends with f_info. And remember, f_info stands for each of these values in our list. It's going to check each and every one of them. So I'm saying if URL ends with .html, .csv, .x or .docx, then we'll do file info valid equals true, right? So it's a lot, yes, and you might be like, well, how would I know to do that? You have to do it once. Once you see it once, it'll make more sense as to why you do it. So basically we're declaring the variable of file info valid, and we're equating it to false. We're creating a for statement using our dummy variable. This dummy variable is going to represent each and every one of these values. It's going to go through the entire list to check against them. And we're saying if each of these is in the valid info, which is this list, then if URL ends with f_info, file info valid equals true. So it's a bit confusing, but you'll see that it does run. So that's that. The final thing they want us to do is write the conditions to return a Boolean value of true if the URL is valid, and false if either the protocol or the file extension is not valid. So for this, it's just an easy if-else statement. We're going to start with if, and we're just going to use, I believe we're going to use these two, the true and false. So, well, this and, where's the other one? Was it protocol? No, protocol valid here. Well, it would be this. It'd be one of the two. It'd be this, or this and this. So we'll do if protocol valid, and the AND operator, file info underscore valid. So if both of those protocols are valid, meaning like they're true, well, no. uh, if protocol valid is true, no, yeah, if protocol valid is true and protocol valid is true, then and return true. So we'll do return no true. Else, do else, and then we would return false. And the final thing was get rid of this because I already turned true if URL is valid, else false. I already did that up there. Get rid of that. And then we have that final piece of code that they did for us. I'm gonna actually uppercase this because it should be uppercase. So this is basically so this line of code will determine whether our .py file, the file name is main. Yes, it is main up here, but that's not exactly what they mean by when they write this code, if name equals main. So even if our name was different, the way this works is that when the Python interpreter reads a .py file, the variable name that it gives it is main. So like when it does run, so if I do python3 main.py, unindent does not match any outer indentation level. Okay, so okay. So I did figure out what was wrong with my code as far as incorrect syntax. My indentation was a little bit off. So I just played around with uh, putting it in, putting it out. But the major thing that was wrong was, so at the very, I believe it was line 10 where it said my first issue was. At the very end of my if statement, I forgot to put a colon. So after protocols, I didn't put a colon, and that was where the main issue was. I forgot colons elsewhere as well, so on line 14, I didn't put a colon after file info. Line 15, I didn't put a colon, and line 18, I didn't put a colon. So try to space out yours as I did mine. So just look at mine, put your code all the way to the left and just start indenting. I did one tab and it got me there. Next line, one tab. Make sure that they're lined up as mine is. That way you don't run into that indentation issue. And so now we can get back to me showing you what the if name equals main does. So I'm going to scroll all the way down. At the very bottom, or let me clear this. That way it's nice and clear as to what I'm doing. So I'm going to do python3 main.py, enter a URL. I'm going to enter in, let me go all the way back to this and copy and paste one of these URLs. I'm going to take the first one. Okay, so I'm going to paste it here and press enter. So it gives me true. True why? Because when protocol valid, or if protocol valid, meaning if protocol is true and file info valid is true, then it's going to return true. Else, it's going to return false. So if when this program checks protocol valid and say it gave it false, protocol valid equals false, and when it ran this and it said protocol valid is false, then it's going to return false. Yeah. That's basically it. And when I run this, it should also give me a valid. Does take a second. Okay. And step 4. So this was more of an optional thing. So it says your task will be manually graded by your instructor to check that the goals and the requirements for the task have been met. So this is importing pip or installing pip, whatever package you can do. Like you do pip install requests. There, it's going to install it for you. If I do pip uninstall, it's actually going to attempt to do it, but it's not going to do it successfully. As you'll see, I do yes. Yeah, you don't have the rights to do that. Then you can do pip list. This final step I don't really care as much about, so don't worry about it. You can just press the check mark. It'll give you a passing grade. And that's really it. That's the lab. It was long. I ran into some errors with my code, as I'm sure you guys have all done so yourselves. I forgot the colons. My spacing was, I believe it was fine. I didn't change my spacing here. I was moving the lines of code back and forth, but this is the correct spacing. Obviously, you can get some other programs, like you can install something called Sublime Text, and what that does is it kind of helps you know where your indentations are. It's a little bit more clear that way. You can write your code in there and then copy and paste into here if you're having issues with spacing. So that's kind of what I did. I do use Sublime Text for spacing. It does like kind of show you where certain groups of code are grouped together. Um, so yeah, it's not mandatory, but it is helpful. But yeah, just make sure you do your colons at the end, and that should fix your syntax error as it did mine. And